I think we are going to continue to see more and more people using these advanced procedures, especially, when you've got a nice mare and you want to keep her in the show pen. It has become more affordable and more accessible, particularly embryo transfer, and it's a lot more commonplace. So with that kind of comes a more cost-effective approach.
Bring them in on the rail at a jog, please. On the rail at a jog.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of On the Rail podcast. Today's episode is based on listener requests on the reproduction and breeding side of our entire industry. So I think this conversation will get pretty interesting. And we're super excited to have Chelsea on the podcast. So Chelsea, if you want to just tell us a little bit about you, describe, your personal background in the horse industry and what you do now.
Perfect. So I have grown up with horses all my life, come by it honestly. Grandma got me on a horse as soon as she could. I actually grew up doing more USEF type hunters and then came to college, fell in love with a little APHA weanling filly, and that's how I got here. So that's where it all started for me in the stock horses. I was also on the university's collegiate judging team. And so that also really sparked an interest for me in the stock horses. And so I kind of took her, competed with her on the APHA circuit. And then I now have a stallion. His name is No Doubt This Is Hot. And we have been showing on AQHA, APHA, and NSBA circuits. And I've also got a 3-year-old filly coming up. So that's kind of how I got involved in the industry itself. While I was also doing my undergrad at Clemson, the degree itself is in animal and vet science, and my concentration was equine business. I actually came here for undergrad with the goal of managing a large hunter jumper facility, kind of show facility, training facility, that kind of thing. But I actually fell in love with breeding while I was an undergrad here. Got really heavily involved through a class that we offered, and then was a teaching assistant for the class. And then I did go and manage that large hunter jumper facility after graduation, but really wanted to go back into breeding. So that led me then to Kansas State University, where I got my master's and my PhD in reproductive physiology.
Wow.
And so, yeah, that's how I ended up here. Crazy.
It's so funny because I talk to Liz sometimes about this, like 6 degrees of separation or 3 degrees of separation in the horse world. So I graduated from Kansas State in, oh my God, so many years ago now, 2007 in animal science. So I didn't know you were at Kansas State. So that's near and dear to my heart. So that's point one. And then point two is I didn't realize you were you until I started, trying to look up your information and whatnot on Facebook to come on the podcast. And I remember watching, I think the AQHA World Show this past year. And there was this big, loud, like bald-faced horse in the class. And of course, I'm a paint girl. So like the color speaks to me. So just a small world, because that's your stallion, correct? He's double registered, but very, by quarter horse standards, very loud colored.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, I love that.
It's so okay. It makes us stand out. So I guess we better do a good job, right?
Yes, that's amazing. So you're showing your stallion yourself still, I assume. Are you now raising babies for him? What are you doing, like breeding, raising, showing yourself right now?
So as far as personal brood mares, all I have is his mother. So not breeding her to him. A little too close there. But I do manage Clemson University's equine breeding program. And so here we do raise, we have a couple warm blood hunter mares. We have a couple AQHA hunter mares. We've got a Western pleasure mare and a Rainer mare, all AQHA there. And so we do have one baby personally here out of my stallion, but a lot of others coming from other mare owners. And so right now, all of my horses are related, so they don't get to breed each other.
You're smart there. Does Clemson have a number of stallions? Do you guys stand any stallions there for this university?
We do stand my stallion here, and he's following in his sire's footsteps and being a really, really sweet teaching stallion. He's really easy to handle, has great manners, and pretty straight shooter. No pun intended.
Say literally, figuratively.
Oh, shoot.
And then we have Ripley. He is our old geriatric hunter stallion. He's a thoroughbred. Even in his prime, he wasn't super big on doing stallion things. He had kind of a poor libido. And now that he's, about 30 some odd years old, he's decided that he's a pet.
Aw.
Yeah, and he's real great and sweet too, but he's just hanging out in retirement right now.
30 some years old.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, he's great. At Kansas State University, we had a number of our own stallions, as well as we did a fair number of outside stallions and outside mares as well. So I've kind of had a wide variety of experience. I've stood everything from gypsy vanners to hunters to barrel studs to reiners to pleasure studs, a little bit of everything in between.
Yeah. This will get interesting, I feel like, in our conversation. So what initially got you started in the equine reproduction world for a career path?
Well, like I was saying, I wanted to go into farm management and really fell in love with the breeding side of things when I was an undergrad and just kind of couldn't shake that. And I knew I wanted to go get my master's with the goal of actually being a breeding farm manager. And then during my master's, I fell in love with the teaching and the research side of things. So then decided to continue with the PhD and kind of landed in academia coming off of that. And it's nice because I get to teach, I get to do a little bit of research. I get to manage the breeding program. So it's something different every day. So that's really nice. And it's great to kind of spark that interest in students as well. The breeding industry is always looking for new people to come into it in terms of people that are interested in that management and that science behind it. It's a dirty job, so it's not something that appeals to everyone, and it's very involved, for us, at least, our breeding season is at least kind of coupled into a 4 or 5 month time period for the most part. But for those 4 or 5 months, that's all you're doing.
Shoulder deep in something.
Shoulder deep, always, and it is super rewarding. I think it's just kind of hard to find the people that want to kind of put that level of dedication into it and then also live their lives 4 months out of the year being covered in unimaginable things.
Have you seen a trend that it's harder to get people interested in this avenue of the industry, or is it kind of stayed the same since you've been around it?
I don't think it's hard to get people interested in it. I think it's hard to keep people in it. And that's just because it is all consuming, and unfortunately, it's not a business that's for the faint of heart. You always have to remind yourself when things go wrong or you have, something that is tragic occur, like losing a foal or losing a mare. You have to remind yourself of all the wonderful things you've experienced and all the success stories you have. And, when you get that win photo of a baby at a big show that you bred and raised, it makes it all worth it. But I think in the short term, people struggle with that mental and physical stamina that comes along with it. And I think you can really talk about two different populations of breeders. You've got the DIY breeders that are ultrasounding their own mares, collecting their own studs, doing the breeding themselves. And then you've got the breeders that rely on professionals, to kind of do that end for them. And, obviously there's advantages to doing it yourself in terms of cost savings, but it is laborious. And I think a lot of breeders, they're also full-time workers, they're mothers, fathers, things like that. And, it can wear on you, when you're on full watch all those nights, and then you got to get your mares ultrasounded in the morning before you go to work and all those things. So I think it's just a mental and a physical stamina involved. So I think people get into it under the impression that, it's not that consuming, but it is. So definitely not hard to get people interested. It's hard to keep people in it for the long run.
I just had this conversation yesterday at the barn. One of the farriers, he has a mare that he breeds once a year. And last year, he was telling me yesterday, because I asked if he had rebred her or not, and she's due next month. But from last year, it was like 2:30 in the morning. He checked the cameras, but he just had that feeling that she was going to go at some point. Mm-hmm. And when he looked again at 4, the foal was like in the middle of the stall, but still in the bag. So, lost the foal. And I was like, me personally, I could never do that end of it. I'll take something that's already, well established at 6 months old and
alive.
Because I don't know, seeing a foal that you've waited on for over a year and it not make it, or the mare even, I don't think I could do it.
It is definitely really tough. And, I'll be completely honest. My first APHA show mare, the filly that I mentioned, I fell in love with and kind of sent me down this never ending rabbit hole of quarter horses and paint horses. She's actually in foal with her first baby right now. She's in foal to my stallion, but I actually leased her out. And it's kind of a weird thing to verbalize there, but it was almost like I know too much and I know all the things that can happen, and I just needed it to
be somebody else's,
be under the watch of someone else. And also, there's absolutely no way I could make myself sell that baby. So I was like, you know what? I'll just remove that as a choice.
Yeah. So. See, I have this problem coming up because one of my heart horses is due the middle of March here. And I already know this. My plan for this whole thing is this baby has to be for sale because I can't keep all of them. And she's not at my house on purpose. Yep. So I'm already trying to prepare myself. I'm not keeping this thing. It's got to be for sale. But so I totally get that though. I can relate hardcore.
Well, and it does make it so much easier when for sure they're in a really good show home. I've been really fortunate, all my personal babies have ended up with friends of mine in the show industry. So I know exactly what their life looks like and where they're going to show, and I get to keep up with them. And that always makes things a lot easier. It's harder. And I think, what a lot of people don't necessarily get from the start is once you sell that foal, it's really a grace of the current owner to keep you updated. You're not entitled to it, and I think that's where some people get hurt feelings or damaged relationships or things like that. But, realistically, when you sell a horse, you have to do so with the notion of knowing that you don't have control over that horse anymore.
Yep.
And I think people struggle with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's definitely a hard piece to it. But and breeding's tough, but it is so worth it. Those moments are so great. And, you get to dream up that nice cross and all the anticipation and everything. And, a lot of times it works out beautifully. Unfortunately, sometimes it doesn't, but that's like anything with life, and I think you just have to take those experiences and learn from them is the best advice there.
On the subject of hard work, do you want to briefly kind of describe what getting your PhD, the whole process was like and how that was?
Have you ever just lit yourself on fire and walked across a bed of nails? That's
and people decide to do this all the time for some reason.
Oh, yes. Yes. I joke. I had a wonderful major professor, Dr. Joanne Kuba at Kansas State, and then Dr. Jeff Stevenson, who's a world-renowned dairy repro physiologist. And both of them were phenomenal mentors. It is a lot of work. And I think one of the things you should realize going into something like that is you get out of it what you put into it. Unlike most grad students, I actually was on a teaching assistantship. So I had sole responsibility for teaching several classes as well as running the breeding program. And so it's one of those things where, I didn't necessarily get paid more than other grad students, but you couldn't be bitter about having more work to do because that was getting you the experience. And there's definitely a difference between people that pursue a PhD in reproduction where they're mostly basic science focused. So they're more focused on lab side of things. And then practical and management type research where you do have that basic research side of things, but you're also applying it to real world scenarios, and as curious as I am about the way things work, I always like to tie that into how does this help a breeding manager make decisions or manage their horses or things like that. I'm one of those people that likes to have a tangible end goal, so I think the research that I did was always with the goal of not only understanding the physiology of it, but also how can we help mare owners, stallion owners, things like that be more efficient in what they're doing. And so the process, it's, in a PhD, it's a little bit different. You're kind of thrown in the deep end of the pool a little bit. You're told to find a good question that you want to answer and figure out how to do it versus a master's, you're getting your hand held a lot more, and that's more of, okay, here's a cool project. This is what I want you to work on versus the PhD is figure out a project and go work on it, and it is a great experience, and it's certainly hard, and it's a little bit different of a route than a lot of your classic repro people will take. They'll go to vet school and then do internship and residency for Therio and then get board certified. Again, the problem is it's kind of hard to find people that want to go that route. We see this a lot, in working with students our department is very much designed to help prepare students for admission and to be successful in vet school. And I'm completely honest here. I'm very concerned about what our large animal medicine situation is going to look like in 10, 15 years. And I think even more so, it's hard to convince people to go in on the repro side there because it is dirty and, for a large chunk of the year, that's all you're doing. And so I think that's where a lot more people are going to start wanting to kind of DIY their programs, and we see a lot of people out there wanting to look for those courses and things so they can learn how to inseminate their mares. Eventually they can learn how to ultrasound their mares, things like that. And I think all those things are great. That all works really well as long as everything's working well. I think when you start to run into issues, that's where that experience level comes into play. So you can make the calls and know what to do.
I know I've talked to a couple mare owners and some smaller stallion owners that have learned to do ultrasound and whatnot themselves. So there does seem like there is some shift to people trying to be able to DIY it, like you said, for better or for worse. I know ultrasounding is a pretty touchy subject to start going into on your own. But the other funny thing is Dr. Kuba was my advisor, when I was in my undergrad at K-State. So again, small world, but
she's pretty awesome.
Yeah, she was great. So describe us what your average day is like at Clemson during the springtime.
Yeah. So springtime, I typically start my day, at least on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, with a repro lab. And so I teach a class where there's a 3 credit hour lecture that teaches them all the physiology and then a 1 credit hour lab where they're out here arm deep with me, getting willy collected, ultrasounding the mares. They get assigned to a mare and they're responsible for doing all of her milk strip testing. They're responsible for full watching and fulling her out, obviously under supervision, and things like that. So really my day kind of starts with that. And I love that so much because I do get to share my love for it with the students. And you quickly find out the ones that are interested in it and then the ones that thought they were interested in it and then decide otherwise.
Not quite as glamorous as they were first thinking it was going to be.
No, not so much. I think the nice smell of schloob, as we call it, first thing in the morning, it's a turn off to some people. More often than not, though, you end up with the students, they were kind of interested in it, and then they're really all in interested. One of my students in it this semester came by my office the other day, and they just watched their mare foal out a couple nights prior, and he came in and he said, "That's the most impactful experience of my entire life." And so that's super rewarding, and it's fun to get to share that with them as well. And we always kind of talk about kind of the way we do things, why we do it, and then I think most breeding managers can attest to this. You get a little bit OCD about your lab and your practices and, how that day goes. But it's nice to kind of teach them how to put that physiology into work into the breeding shed. So that's always super rewarding. I also teach other classes. Those are usually scheduled in the afternoon during the springtime. That way if we've got mares to breed in the morning, anything odd like a post-foaling lavage, things like that, my mornings are pretty open to be able to go do that. So this spring, I also teach a course in principles of equine evaluation. And then we also do a livestock exhibition techniques class. So students learn, they pick a species that they want to work with. So a horse, a dairy cow, a beef cow, a ewe lamb, a chicken. I don't know what inspires them to do chickens, but it actually looks pretty fun. And they all get to learn how to show. They get assigned an animal, learn how to show them. And then at the end of the semester, they have a big show. So it's a good way to get students involved and on the farm and breathing fresh air and not holed up in their dorm rooms and just getting them involved a little more. It's kind of a tradition. K-State had a similar class as well. Most land-grant universities that have animal science programs do that. So
I had to take a poultry science class in my time at K-State, and I am still haunted by that class to this day because we had to gas chickens in class and then dissect them on the spot. And I'm not qualified or cut out to do anything like that, which is why I'm I could never go to vet school. That is not for me.
That, for the majority of my life, the plan was to go to vet school, and I shadowed a vet freshman year of high school. And on the very first day, we had to euthanize somebody's 7-year-old Labrador retriever. And I was literally crying for weeks. And I was like, I don't think this is the best choice for me.
Yeah. God bless the people that can do that because the world needs them. But not for me either.
No, I don't think I have the mental toughness that's required for that.
Yeah. So we do want to kind of get into the discussion of the different reproductive techniques that are available to us. But before we do that, just curious what you think or how you think breeding technology has evolved since you started.
It's kind of funny. I was actually having this discussion with my class the other day. When I first started, most people were using just either cooled or frozen semen for artificial insemination, and embryo transfer was kind of more the exception instead of the rule. And it was, relatively few people doing that at the time. It was the very high dollar horses. And now it's kind of getting to the point where embryo transfer almost seems as commonplace as just regular artificial insemination. And now in its place is ICSI, which is kind of emerging as the newer, bigger, better technology, if you will. We've got more and more labs that do ICSI popping up and more people interested in it. So I think we've, in a relatively short period of time, really started utilizing that technology as more commonplace than it was when I first started. And I think we'll continue to see that trend grow.
Have the success rates then improved on all of these advanced technologies? I assume since you've started, or is it about?
The success rates are really pretty good. You'd be surprised, embryo transfer seems like a really complex thing. You're literally taking an embryo out of one horse and putting it in another. It's really not that delicate of a process. The hardest part is getting the mare synced up. Sometimes you do flush some lower quality embryos and the survival rate is reduced in those. But realistically, the success rate's pretty solid, and it's been that way for a while. I do think places are getting larger and larger recipient mare herds. And I think that, if anything, has probably improved the success rates just because you have a greater number of mares that are candidates to receive the donor embryo. And the more mares you have to choose from so you can pick the one that's the most perfect, the better. And I think it's a great outlet for some of those mares that don't need to reproduce their own babies, but are capable of it. So I think that's a good place for those horses. I think we are going to continue to see more and more people using these advanced procedures, especially, when you've got a nice mare and you want to keep her in the show pen. It has become more affordable and more accessible, particularly embryo transfer, and it's a lot more commonplace. So with that kind of comes a more cost-effective approach. And in the great grand scheme of things, is $5,000 a lot of money? It kind of depends on what you're producing. The general rule of thumb is I would expect to spend about $5,000 on the embryo transfer, all said and done, by the time you pay for the recipient mare lease, the flushes, the ultrasound work, getting the recipient mare through her heartbeat check, things like that. I'd say $5,000, a decently safe estimate, and gives you a little bit of wiggle room if the first try doesn't.
That's outside of a stud fee, correct?
Outside, yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Stud
Unfortunately.
fee.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think honestly, we see this a lot more commonplace. And I don't think we want to get too much into cloning or anything like that, but the reining and cutting side of our industry, I think really gravitates towards that before it kind of reaches the more Western pleasure hunt seat side of things. So it's interesting. I think, when we compare values, my students always ask me like, well, how much is a baby worth? And it's like, well, that's
it's a crapshoot, really.
Like, well, that's hard, and they're like, well, what about a quarter horse? And I'm like, well,
that's a crapshoot too.
And so I think when you're doing those procedures, it's either because the cross would result in something that is marketable enough to justify it, or it's an emotional, something that you're really attached to and want the baby out of. And so I think that's what drives that, and it is nice because, a stallion can, I dare say, an endless number of babies. That's not really realistic, but right, the stallion can produce hundreds, of babies a year. With these emerging technologies, now we can get more than one foal out of a mare per year. And some of those mares, that's extremely valuable. A really productive mare, you can expect in her lifetime that she'll maybe produce, a dozen foals, sometimes more, sometimes less. But embryo transfer and ICSI and things like that allow us to really distribute the mare's genetics a little better.
Yeah. So I know like part of my purpose of getting you on is to discuss advanced reproductive technologies. So we'll get to that. But I think it would be good for us and our listeners to kind of start at the basic level and then get more involved and more difficult from there. So
I'm still hung up on the whole embryo transfer because that's still crazy to me that we do that. So yeah, base level for me, for sure.
So we'll start from the ground and then go up. But kind of what we would like to kind of give a general overview for everybody is, one, what is it? Who's it best for? What's involved on the stallion side and the mare side, and then maybe average success rate and cost. So we'll kind of keep those parameters in mind and we can remind you if we need to go. But first one would then, of course, be live cover, which not as many people use anymore by any means, particularly in our stock breed world, unless you're doing like a small farm thing. But thoroughbreds still rely on live cover. So do you do much of this at Clemson with thoroughbreds, or where's your experience out there?
We do not do a ton of live cover here. They used to several decades ago when they had an Arabian breeding program, but I'm not against it. I just don't prefer live cover breeding. I think I might be a little bit too type A for that.
There's a lot of things that can go wrong.
Yeah. And especially on the stallion owner end, there's safeguards in place to make sure that stallion, is safe. Obviously, you make sure the mare's ready and receptive, to breeding. And then oftentimes, you might hobble them or sedate them, just for that extra layer of security. But I think my brain always thinks in terms of like Final Destination movie and all the things that can go wrong, so it's a little bit tougher for me to be comfortable with it. We did some of it at Kansas State, and it definitely has a place. There's large, really well-known, established breeding programs that are almost exclusively live cover. And I think it, in a lot of cases, can be more affordable. I think you tend to have two different levels of it. You've got the most hands-off version where you're really doing pasture breeding. So you're putting the stallion in with a mare or a group of mares and kind of letting them take care of it. And that would certainly be the least hands-on approach. And then you've got, the next step of it where you're doing the in-hand live cover, and a lot of times they're ultrasounding those mares and, making sure they're ready and things like that. There's a lot of risks associated with it, obviously, with injury to the mare, the stallion, and the handler. And then we also run the risk of there's several diseases that can be transmitted sexually as well. So I think that's another consideration for it. So I think it's the right practice for some programs. Others, I think it's a different situation. Artificial insemination has really allowed us to distribute genetics further. And realistically, I think even in live cover programs, if there's a stallion that somebody really wants to breed to, but he's 1,200 miles away, they'll take the mare out. But in a lot of cases, it is easier to collect and then ship the semen and do all that. Certainly more cost effective at that point with gas prices the way they are now. Yeah.
So if we move on we can kind of lump like cooled semen and frozen semen together in a way of what gets involved on the mare and stallion side. But I know there's maybe a small difference in success rates between the two. So yeah, who's it good for? Who's it not good for? What are the considerations and kind of average cost that you would need to consider?
So under most circumstances, I would say cooled artificial insemination, cooled or fresh artificial insemination would be suitable for just about any mare. Now, that being said, there is a very small percentage of mares that are allergic to some of the ingredients in the extenders that we use for semen. And so those mares, it's not to say they aren't good artificial insemination candidates, but they really need to be on site and inseminated with fresh semen, versus adding in that extender there. I think there is a little bit of confusion among people, I think. So we have this condition called PBIE, or post-breeding induced endometritis. So it's essentially an inflammation of the endometrium in the mare's uterus in response to breeding. And realistically, for her to clear that semen back out, it is an inflammatory response. But some mares have a bigger inflammatory response than others, and it causes them to pool fluid in their uterus. And that's a relatively common condition, and that could occur in live cover scenarios as well. And I think people confuse that with the mare being allergic to extender. The reality is it's a very, very small percentage, like less than 2% of mares that are actually allergic to extender. And there's a lot of management techniques that we can use to abate that. If we've got a mare that we know, we call it blowing fluid, post-breeding, we'll go ahead and either do a post-breeding lavage several hours after we breed her, sometimes the next day, as well as follow that up with some oxytocin to help her clear that fluid out. And those mares that tend to do that oftentimes aren't very good candidates for frozen semen artificial insemination, because the cryoprotectants that we put in the extender for frozen semen tends to be more inflammatory, more insulting to the uterus, if you will. So I think those mares that tend to have a big reaction in response to being inseminated, those necessarily aren't the best candidates for frozen semen.
How do you determine between a mare that is allergic to extender versus some other issue going on? Is it just a certain amount of like failed pregnancies that you eventually figure it out? Or is there some kind of reaction you guys see that you're like, this is an allergic reaction? Or how does that come about?
So she would need to be clinically evaluated and actually measure her inflammatory markers on a blood panel in order to officially diagnose that. And in other cases, you could even, I've done this in the past where I've taken a really small amount of extender with no semen in it and put it through her cervix into her uterus while she's in heat to see what happens, just for my own knowledge on the mare to see what she's sensitive to, and another big thing is the amount of fluid that we're putting into their uterus. A lot of times with artificial insemination, we're using a much smaller volume of fluid than she would have under live cover scenarios. Especially frozen semen is an even smaller volume, and the less volume that she has to clear back out of her uterus, the better. And so in the caveat there being with frozen semen, because of those cryoprotectants, it can be a little bit more inflammatory. Not all stallions are great candidates for frozen semen. Some of stallion semen really it's not very hardy when you compare it to like bull semen. Bull semen, I mean, you can like almost leave it on the dash in your car in the summer and it'll be fine. Stallion semen is a lot less tolerant, and it's a lot less tolerant to a lot of the handling and processing techniques that we use. And some stallions just don't freeze very well. And so we always do test freezes ahead of doing big batches of frozen semen to make sure the stallion is going to be a good candidate for it. And what we're looking for there is at least 30% post-thaw motility. And so not all stallions are good candidates for frozen semen. Not all mares are good candidates for frozen semen, particularly your older multi-pairs. So they've had several mini foals. You know, they tend to have a harder time with that frozen semen and the inflammatory response that comes with it versus your younger, I should say, younger uterus mares. You know, generally younger maiden mares that have had, you know, only a handful of foals are usually fine for it.
Is the success rate much different between cooled and frozen, assuming the mare isn't, you know, a poor breeding candidate right now, or are they closer to equal these days?
They're closer to equal. And I think that's for a multitude of reasons. And this is if we're assuming that the stallion froze well. So he's got good post-thaw motility, and assuming that the mare is of good reproductive health. I think, you know, the percentages aren't that far off, you know, and part of that is we're pretty used to handling it. It's pretty commonplace now. The other part of frozen semen, you know, when we're breeding using cooled semen, we want to inseminate her just prior to ovulation, versus with frozen semen, we actually inseminate them just after ovulation. And why frozen semen breeding is generally more expensive on the clinical side is because we're ultrasounding those mares every 4 to 6 hours. And that includes overnight, you know, so we can, as soon as we first detect ovulation, we can go ahead and thaw that semen and inseminate her. And so I think because you're kind of taking out the timing issues that we have on the cooled side, I think your percentages are relatively pretty similar there.
That is actually something I never knew, that you wait till they actually ovulate for frozen to inseminate them.
And some clinicians, they will actually, so we generally give them an ovulation inducing agent like HCG or deslorelin, you know, so we kind of have an idea when she'll ovulate. But like I tell my students all the time, it's biology. So there's not really rules, there's suggestions.
Guidelines.
Yeah. You know, so I think some clinicians will actually 12 hours or so, or 24 hours after they give them HCG or deslorelin, they'll go ahead and put in one dose and then put in a second dose after they detect ovulation. But in large part, say you have one dose, you're using that as soon as you detect ovulation.
Do you typically get 2 straws still with frozen?
It depends. I think on our side of the industry, it's pretty common practice to give 2 doses unless you are buying it by the dose, which is a much more commonplace practice in the warm blood side of things. They'll typically do kind of a more standard contract, like what we're used to on the quarter horse side of things, or they'll do it where they sell frozen semen by the dose at a cheaper rate, but there's no live full guarantee or anything like that. It's a little bit interesting how the warm blood side of things does it. You know, for us, especially if the stallion is still living and things like that, and we're not limited on our frozen semen supply, most of the time they're sending 2 doses.
Okay, so let's kind of morph that discussion into fresh embryo transfers or cooled embryo transfers, and then frozen embryo too a little bit.
So, you know, like I said, embryo transfer has gotten so commonplace now. You know, I think if you call around and try to find a recipient mare contract right now, that'll give you a good idea of how popular it is. You know, by this point in the year, most large facilities are sold out of recipient mare contracts, you know, and so there your option is to freeze the embryos and wait for the next season, or, you know, see if a mare becomes available, things like that. The process itself, you know, really isn't all that delicate. So, you know, you breed the mare just like you would if you were breeding her to carry. And then 7 days post ovulation, we'll flush her uterus, you know, to try to retrieve an embryo. You can't really do it much earlier than that because the embryo actually doesn't even enter the uterus until about 5 days post ovulation. And you don't want to do it much later than that, with the exception of older mares or mares bred using frozen semen. We usually flush them on day 8. And so, at that point, you hopefully retrieve a good looking embryo. The embryo is graded. Typically you want a grade 1 or grade 2 embryo in order to have a good chance at being successful. The tricky part is, you flush her out and then you search underneath a disc that has grids on it so that you know that you've searched each part. The trickier part is making sure you have mares lined up. And I kind of want to touch on this because I think there's a large misconception with people on this. I see ads all the time for people on Facebook that say they're in search of a recipient mare. The problem is that recipient mare has to be perfectly synced up with your donor mare. And you can use pharmaceutical agents to try to do that. But oftentimes in the long run, you end up just spending just as much money trying to get a singular mare synced up with your donor mare. And so I always tell people, it sounds more expensive to go to a bigger facility, that has a big recip herd. But in the long run, it's going to be the same price because they're like Rood and Riddle in Kentucky, for example, they have hundreds of recipient mares. So on any given day, they're going to have 3 to 5 mares, at least 2 to 5 mares that are perfectly lined up with yours. And they're going to take the one that looks the best on that day, on the transfer day, and put that embryo in. So I think your success rates in those types of programs are a lot better than the people that are trying to pick up a recipient mare, sync their mares, and do it that way. So when we're talking about success rates in a larger, well-established, talking 50, 100, 150, 200 recipient mares, your success rates are really good. In terms of your donor mare, your candidate has to have a good uterus. You can't take a mare that has a chronic uterine infection or poor biopsy score, things like that, and do embryo transfer as easily. Just because that uterine environment has to at least be hospitable to that embryo for a couple days before you flush it out. So if you've got a mare that, is chronically inflamed, persistently infected, things like that, that's not going to be a good embryo transfer candidate. That's where you're going to have to go kind of to the next steps.
Before we jump into that one, is there much different in cost or success rate between fresh or cooled embryo transfers versus frozen embryo transfers?
Your success rates on frozen embryo transfers are certainly going to be lower just because that cryopreservation process does run the risk of damaging some DNA and some components there of that embryo. So the more layers of manipulation in general you add on to whatever reproductive technique you're using, generally the lower your success rates are going to be. So similar to the cooled fresh semen versus cooled versus frozen semen, it's the same thing with embryos. In the most perfect world of worlds, you're able to flush that embryo right out of the donor mare, not cool it, and throw it right into a recipient mare. Next best case scenario is that you cool it and ship it to be put into a recipient mare. The frozen embryo side of things, like I said, those embryos are fairly hardy. Like I said, people think it's a very intense process, but even if you're cooling and shipping an embryo, you're putting it in an equitainer, just like you would for semen. So they're fairly hardy, but the cryopreservation process does, run the risk of damaging the embryo. So your success rates are lower there. However, they do come with some advantages. On the frozen embryo side of things, now we have the technology where you can do a biopsy on that embryo. We've actually got a facility down here in South Carolina. They've got a client that has a whole library of frozen embryos that have been biopsied and sent off for testing. So he knows the sex of the embryo, the color, whether or not it carries any genetic diseases, things like that. And he's literally like, oh, I think I'll order the black filly, this year. And that's really cool. And, obviously there's the aspect at the end of the day, it's horses, right? So your mare, could have a freak accident in the pasture tomorrow, not be here anymore, but you at least still have her genetic material preserved that way. So there's a ton of advantages to freezing the embryos.
That's crazy to me.
Liz is like mind blown. I am too, a little bit, but yeah.
I mean, I don't have the kind of money to do that, but I think it's really cool that other people do.
It's wild that they can test these embryos for that much information ahead of time, but also not damage them. That's the crazy part to me.
Yeah.
Wow, that's cool. So taking it another step further, kind of, I think at the pinnacle in our industry right now is ICSI, or intracytoplasmic sperm injection. Kind of describe on a holistic level what exactly that is for everybody before I ask any more detailed questions about it.
So I think on the human side of things, people are very familiar with the term in vitro fertilization, right? Unfortunately, IVF is very abysmally unsuccessful in horses. And the working theory is that it has to do with incomplete capacitation of the spermatozoa. So it causes some issues in terms of actually fertilizing the oocyte. And in vitro fertilization, I think if my numbers are correct, we've, as a whole, produced 2 foals off of in vitro fertilization. So the success rates just aren't there, which, kind of opened the door for a different technology, which was ICSI. So intracytoplasmic sperm injection is where you are selecting a single spermatozoa and directly inserting it into a mature oocyte, and then creating an embryo in vitro and then implanting that into a recipient mare. The technology itself really wasn't very successful in horses until they came up with a new technique kind of mid 2000s. And instead of the pipette kind of punching through the oocyte, it vibrates its way into the oocyte to deposit the spermatozoa. And so it causes a lot less damage. So the success rates in ICSI in horses have been much better since then. You also kind of get more chances, right? Because, when we're flushing an embryo on a mare, we're super excited when we get 1. We need to go buy a lottery ticket, if we get 2, and we need to go buy 10 lottery tickets if we get 3. And that's because mares' ovaries are actually inside out. So from other species, so they can only ovulate from one location on the ovary, versus cattle, we can super ovulate them and flush embryos from them and get a dozen on a regular basis. And of course, horses are difficult. We don't get to do that.
They wouldn't be horses if they didn't have these characteristics.
No, why would they? And so the ICSI process there, you kind of get more chances because you'll generally end up with somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 6 viable oocytes out of the procedure, and so you get 5 or 6 chances there. Now, that being said, the process for harvesting those oocytes, essentially what they're doing, a lot of times we'll give a mare HCG or something along those lines to kind of help her develop more antral follicles. And then we essentially take an ultrasound guided needle and we puncture each one of those follicles and flush it out to get the oocyte harvested from the follicle off of the ovary. And it sounds like super invasive procedure, and obviously it is, but it's really not as traumatic as you would think it is. You can actually do that procedure every 2 weeks on a mare. So if you're really interested in getting a lot, that might be your way to go, especially if you're freezing embryos, things like that.
You puncture them, is it transvaginally?
Yes.
I remember back in the day, my sister worked at Colorado State's Repro Lab for a little while, but I remember when they were first working on this type of stuff and they had these huge incisions in the flanks of mares to pull out oocytes. So obviously we've come a long ways from having to do that.
Yeah. And technique is utilized still in some places, but it's a really fun procedure to watch, actually. So, it takes 2 people because, the practitioner's got their arm through the rectum and kind of cupping that ovary to push it up kind of in the ideal spot to be able to reach it from the vagina to then punch the needle through and flush out the follicle to retrieve those oocytes. Yeah, it's pretty intense. And that's where your mares, like I talked about, that weren't necessarily good embryo transfer candidates, that's kind of the next step for those mares, right? Because an embryo doesn't have a good chance of survival if it's coming into a hostile environment, and so if the mare's uterus is hostile, TBA and ICSI is the way to go.
So if you harvest an oocyte or an egg from the mare, you pull that out, then in the lab setting, it's literally one sperm or spermatozoa, I think, is injected into an oocyte.
Yep.
That is cultured and developed in a lab for several days. Is that correct?
The embryo is
the embryo.
in the
Yeah.
lab.
Yeah. And then if that is a successful embryo, then that would be turned around and put into a reset mare. So for all those steps to align, what's the success rate on all of this to where you get actually a viable pregnancy in a reset mare?
They're fairly good. Like I said, you kind of get more chances, so to speak, and I would say, say you end up with 6 mature oocytes that are candidates for the procedure. I'd say you're probably looking at 2 or 3 of those into viable embryos, and then 1 to 2 of those actually successfully establishing into a pregnancy. So just like anything, it's a little bit survival of the fittest, right? But you kind of get more swings at it, if you will, using that procedure versus an embryo transfer. So I think in a lot of cases, the procedure is very successful. I wouldn't say it's quite up to the level of regular artificial insemination, certainly not. I'd say embryo transfer is probably a little bit more successful yet. And then, you shave off a couple more percentage points, on the ICSI procedure. But, on a scientific setting, we talk about things being statistically significant. Just because the numbers are different doesn't mean that statistically speaking, one procedure would be more successful than the other. A lot of it boils down to the practice and how diligent people are. I tell my students all the time, 90% of being successful in breeding is due diligence, making sure you do checks when they need to be checked. Don't be lazy, things like that. And that goes a long way in being successful in those programs.
And then cross your fingers and do a little dance at the end of the night and run around your couch 5 times and pray to the breeding gods.
I literally say every season, may the odds be ever in your favor.
Yeah. So before we kind of wrap that up, well, 2 questions. I guess my one is, what are the costs associated with ICSI above and beyond like just a regular, shipped semen protocol type thing outside of stud fees, of course? How much more expensive are we talking ICSI would be?
Last I checked, or last I priced around on it, you're looking at about $7,500 to $10,000, depending on the situation. So, again, the potential foal better be worth it, monetary wise or sentimental wise, in order to pull that off. The other good thing about ICSI is you can do a post-mortem harvest. If you can get that mare into a clinic that can do it fast enough or euthanize her at the clinic, what they can do is harvest oocytes from a mare that has passed away within a certain window of time. And same thing with stallions. You can actually do an epididymal harvest of sperm as well. So that's, I think, I shouldn't say favorite because that sounds bad, but in my opinion, the most valuable application of that procedure, would be those 2 scenarios.
For sure. Especially in unintended or some type of situation where you weren't counting on losing said mare or stallion in that time frame. Yeah. So, yeah. And then last question on this before we kind of start our wrap up questions. Did see a recent advertisement of a farm with stallions available with sexed semen. And I know that's not your necessary area of expertise, but what should we know about that? And kind of just like generally, how is that done and how accurate is the technology, maybe roughly?
Yeah. So the technology is actually fairly accurate. It's about 90% accurate. There's several different methods of sexing semen. The most common would be using flow cytometry. I don't really want to call it a newer procedure or a newer technique, but there is a different technique that's kind of coming about. It's called the MAX procedure, and that's the magnetic activated cell sorting procedure. So that's essentially using the charge, if you will, of each sperm cell to sort them, versus flow cytometry is a little bit more simple in nature because X-bearing spermatozoa, so those that would go on to produce females, weigh more than Y-bearing spermatozoa that would go on to produce males. And that's because they have slightly more genetic information. I
Of course they do.
Of course. I think horses it's about 2 to 3% more genetic information in those X-bearing. And so you essentially use their weight to sort them.
Something so simple with such a advanced technology.
Yeah. The caveat here, so sex sorting semen has been utilized extremely heavy in the dairy industry. And that's because
they need cows.
Correct. And I hate to say something's worthless, but the value of a dairy bull calf is very low. And so they've been utilizing that technology for a really long time. What the holdup has been on our end is, again, stallion semen is not as hardy as bull semen, and it doesn't tolerate the process as well. It can actually cause structural damage to the spermatozoa. It can also cause mitochondrial damage to it as well, damage the DNA, things like that. So they have seen a reduced rate in successfully maturing embryos off of sex sorted semen. And it just gets a little bit trickier. The process is a bit harder in horses, and
they wouldn't be horses if they weren't tricky and difficult.
Difficult, yes.
And it goes to breeding and semen and everything, just carries all the way through. It doesn't surprise me.
Do you think we'll continue to make advances there? If I had to take a guess, we know ICSI's the new embryo transfer, and now we got to have something new to look, into applying on a more wide scale basis. And I do think sex sorting is something that will improve in its efficacy over time, and probably at a pretty rapid rate. There's a lot of research yet to be done in that area on stallion semen. But again, once you have it sorted, the accuracy is 90%. That's pretty impressive there. I would say the bigger demographic that first really started using that was breeders of polo ponies. They pretty much exclusively use mares in that. And so that has been a big thing for them. And I think a lot of people have their preferences. I think the cutters tend to lean more towards the fillies than the colts, and things like that. It kind of just depends. Some people like the colts better. Some people like the fillies better. I think it's a good technology, and I do think it'll be beneficial in the long run. I just tell my students all the time. I actually teach a class called Contemporary Issues in Animal Science. And in this class, I kind of train students to think about things from a holistic viewpoint and all the unintended consequences that come from decisions that are made in animal agriculture. And, at the end of the day, I think all of these technologies that we have are excellent and they're exciting. And obviously, as a reproductive physiologist, I'm, get really excited thinking about it and talking about it. But I do think we have to be good stewards of that technology as well. Animal breeding world, whether we're talking about a cow or a horse or a pig, when we genetically select for something, we are almost always accidentally selecting against something else. So for example, dairy bulls, they've been genetically selected, and over the years, they focus so much on milk production and those type parameters that now, even if we were to leave dairy calves with their mothers after they're born, the majority of those dairy cows aren't good mothers because we've accidentally selected against maternal ability in favor of milk production. Versus the beef industry, they select a lot heavier for maternal traits because they need the cows to take care of their calves.
That's what I was going to say. It'll be interesting from an association standpoint to see what they do, because there was such a hullabaloo about embryo transfers when that first, you could even go back to ship semen. If you really want, every time there's some new technology that comes out, the associations kind of have to figure out where they're going to fall on the spectrum and how their rules are going to be made. And so this whole sex semen thing will surely be a debated topic, I think, in the next year or two.
I think it's great, if people are using it, say I was crazy enough to want another stallion. one day, it'd be nice to have a 90% assurance, right, that I was going to end up with a colt, but I do think we have to be a little bit careful there and not select too heavily for one thing or the other. Otherwise we kind of tend to get ourselves in a little bit of a hole. I give the students the example of how artificial insemination has simultaneously widened the gene pool and shallowed it at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
It's great. We can ship semen anywhere in the world, and that's allowed for a lot of genetic diversity. But on the other hand, it's also allowed stallions to breed a lot more mares year to year. And so that's where we kind of end up with, people call it the flavor of the month stallions and things like that. And these stallions, by all rights and means, are phenomenal producers. But then we end up in situations where the gene pool's a little bit saturated with those genetics. I think it's great, and I think there's a lot of reasons for it. I just think we have to be good stewards. My biggest fear is that when we're using these technologies for individuals that are subfertile, we're actually unintentionally propagating infertility in future generations. And so that's where I get a little bit nervous about the use, the widespread application of all this. Is we certainly don't want to end up in a situation where the majority of our individuals are subfertile or infertile. So thinking long term, I think we just have to be really careful about that. It's one thing if the mare sustained a foaling injury that makes her no longer a good breeding candidate versus one that never was a good breeding candidate to begin with, but now we're using these technologies to get babies out of her. I just think we need to keep that in the back of our minds going forward. Everything has consequences, whether they're obvious or unintentional. I think we have to be a little bit careful.
So as we begin to wrap up here, because I know we've taken enough of your time today on your Sunday, what type of services do you offer there at Clemson? And do you want to provide any social media or contact info, or however somebody may reach you at Clemson to inquire about whatever said services you guys have, all that type of information?
For sure. So here we actually don't offer outside mare services, and that's just because our facility's kind of at max capacity between the breeding horses, the equestrian team horses, the horses that we use for classes, things like that. So we get a little bit limited on space here. So we actually don't offer outside mare services, but we do partner with a local repro vet. She's phenomenal, and that's who we kind of direct all of our mare owners to. We do offer stallion services in terms of collecting and managing them. And then in terms of foaling out mares, we don't do much of that on the outside part of things. One, for space reasons, and two, for liability reasons as well, since we don't have a clinic on site. Very, very fresh news. Clemson is getting a vet school. So that situation might change as we go down the road, but it's in its very babyest beginnings of development there. And so anyway, yeah. So pretty much in terms of outside services, it's on the stallion side. And so cooled ship semen. With regard to embryo transfer, our partner vet clinic down the road, she does a really, really good job with that. She's pretty awesome.
Perfect. Well, we appreciate your time today and your wealth of information on these reproductive stuff. And I feel like we're just scratching the surface, but it's enough to get us started on whatever questions we would have to ask. I have a million more questions I could ask you about mares, but that's a rabbit hole. So,
I think one of the things that would probably be most helpful to the majority of our breeders is kind of what do you need to know what you need to know to be an active in your horse's breeding process. So, potentially maybe there needs to be a part 2 of, just explaining the general process a little bit better so that mare owners know the questions to ask.
What you need to know to even ask about. Yeah, that's a very good idea. We'll make a note of that and maybe do a part 2 with you down the road.
For sure.
Maybe after breeding season when you have time to breathe.
It's spread out pretty good so far this year, so I don't feel super, super stressed.
Not too bad yet. Yeah, good. All right, Chelsea, thank you so much for your time. That's all I had. Liz, you got anything else?
I'm still trying to wrap my head around some of the technology that we have on breeding
I could see
horses.
your face when we were talking about harvesting oocytes. out of a mare transvaginally. She was like, what?
Yeah. No, I'm out.
So cool. Everything they can do, and it'll only get better. We didn't even touch on cloning.
Mm-hmm.
Like, not something I foresee people readily doing anytime in the future. It's funny. I tell my students it costs $18,000 to clone a cow. It costs $85,000 to clone a.
I was like, cloning horses is cost prohibitive for the majority of people, aside from the registration process, which is, a hurdle in itself and a can of worms. But
for sure. But yeah, horse tax.
Yeah, isn't that the truth? We're crazy horse people. Just do it to ourselves. All righty, Chelsea, thank you again. We appreciate your time today.
Yes, thank you.
Just let me know. I'd love to do a repro series. If enough people are interested in it, we can do one on the breeding side, one on the foaling side, one on the stallion side too.
We'll do that. We'll put that when we put this out, and we'll ask that question and see what everybody wants to hear about. And then maybe we can do some follow-up. So that sounds great.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, that'll be your class. Bring them in and line them up.